So guys, the third weight loss strategy would be macro tracking, also known as calorie counting, but I prefer to call it macro tracking as that's pretty much what we're trying to do here. So why would you choose to do macro tracking over these two? Well, one of the main reasons is that you can lose weight on a more consistent and efficient plan. So when you look at the ketogenic diet basically relies on you having higher amounts of protein, higher amounts of fat, lower amounts of carbohydrate or suppressed amounts of carbohydrate. It also forces you to drop the amounts of processed foods that you eat, or that if you choose to eat processed foods, you're not going to have a lot of carbohydrate within your day because you've only got 50 grams of overall carbohydrate to consume. With the intermittent fasting diet, it does allow you to eat a diet which is more familiar to you, but it restricts you in time. So there's a window of time where you can eat, and there's a window of time where you can't eat. However, with the macro tracking, these two aren't as important. And the reason why is because the macros, which are proteins, fats, and carbohydrates, are worked out more around you as an individual. So they are more likely to help you consistently lose weight, but also effectively. What do I mean by that? Well, when you effectively lose weight, you're more likely to drop body fat and you're more likely to keep lean muscle mass or muscle tissue. Now, what tends to be quite hard with macro tracking is the fact that you actually have to do a little bit of maths. You basically have to work out what's known as your BMR, or your basal metabolic rate. And within that, you're then going to decide how much protein, how much fat, and how much carbohydrate you're going to have per day. Actually, macro tracking is quite hard to do and it's quite complicated. And the reason it's quite hard to do is because you've got to work out how many calories you need to consume per day. And that also includes your activity. Well, I've got a nice hard and fast and easy rule for you. Basically, what you want to do is you want to consume quite a large portion of protein per day. And that is quite difficult for some people. But what I'll mention first is that if you can consume between 35 to 45% of your daily intake from protein, then you're doing really well. Now, if you're someone who's a vegan or a vegetarian, you're probably going to find that a little bit more tricky to do. So if you can at least just try to up your protein intake per day and stick within your calorie intake, then you're doing really well. The other thing that you want to try to do is that you want to be able to balance more fat into your diet, okay? So the reason why I want to balance more fat into our diet is because we don't want our insulin, which is this hormone here, to spike too frequently. So the more fat and the more protein we have within our diet basically means that we're not going to spike as much insulin, or we're not going to spike it as sharply. The third rule is, and this applies to carbohydrates, is that you're going to try and reduce the amount of processed carbohydrate, which is basically things like, breads, pastas, potatoes, anything like sugar, sweets, basically. You're going to try and reduce those, and you're going to try and knock those down to roughly 30, maybe 35% per day, okay? And within that 30 to 35%, you should be definitely consuming carbohydrate, which is more vegetable based, perhaps some fruit, and also some things like some salad. Yes, of course, you can have sweet things, you can have breads, you can have pasta, but the more of that stuff you're going to have, the more likely you are going to up your insulin level. So really, basically, all you want to do is have a higher amount of protein, a slightly higher amount of fat, and you want to try and lower, where you can, your carbohydrate intake. And then you want to measure all of that within your calorie expenditure per day. So macro tracking and calorie counting are pretty much the same thing, because you're able to track your macros by understanding how many calories you have. If you don't understand how many calories you need to have per day as an individual person, you're not going to be able to very well track your macros, because each person weighs different. Each person has a different amount of body fat. Each person has a different sort of metabolism, and everyone has a different level of activity as well. So all of those things have to be considered. But rather than bombarding you with all of that information, I think the best way to go about macro tracking is to keep a nice hard and fast rule with those figures that I've just given you. Up your protein, marginally up your fat intake, lower your carbohydrate, especially your processed carbohydrate, and try and find more fruit and vegetables to consume.
It's the Yo Series.